Hello there tonight. We are going to slip past the velvet ropes and thick stone walls of the world's grandest palaces, not to admire the tapestries or trace your fingers along the gilded banisters, but to lie very still in a royal bed next to someone you may or may not know, while an entire kingdom waits to hear what happens next. The sheets are stiffer than you imagined. The air bites at your nose. The room is so large that your whispers echo back to you like ghostly commentary. And out in the corridor, a page, a valet, maybe a very invested mother-in-law, is waiting to report whether the deed was successful. You probably won't survive this. Not socially, not emotionally, and definitely not if you're the one who forgot how many witnesses are supposed to be listening outside the door. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, whether the sun's still peeking over Paris or the moon is sinking into Manila. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The first thing you notice is that palaces are cold, colder than you'd think. Grand echoing rooms weren't made for cuddling. They were built to impress ambassadors, not cradle intimacy. The stone floors beneath your feet seem to hum with chill, and the windows towering elaborate, utterly useless at keeping out drafts let in more wind than warmth. There's a fireplace, sure, but it's mostly ceremonial. It crackles politely without enthusiasm, as if it's only there because someone's job depends on it. The bed, if you can call it that, looms like a ship built for battle. It's set on a platform flanked by towering posts draped in heavy velvet with gold tassels that could throttle a person if they leaned the wrong way. You don't lie in it so much as climb up into it, like ascending a throne, but one meant for two and possibly built for spectators. You're not alone, of course. That's the whole point. Somewhere just outside the curtain, someone is awake. Someone always is. A valet who pretends not to listen. A lady-in-waiting who absolutely does. A chamberlain who jots down times and temperatures not because he cares, but because his job is to care. There is no such thing as privacy here. Not really. Not in royal palaces. The walls have ears, and some of them are attached to people who have titles longer than your whole name. They'll never say what they heard, but they'll say they heard something. And really, in this world, that's more important than truth. Your body swaddled in layer upon layer of silk, wool, and ceremony doesn't feel like your own. The bedclothes are embroidered with your family crest and your spouse's, like a reminder that this is not about you. It's about a merger of bloodlines, of kingdoms, of expectations written centuries ago by people long dead, but still somehow in charge. You lie back. You try not to think about the goosebumps on your arms or the smell of lavender sachets stuffed beneath the pillows. You try not to hear the shuffle of feet outside the door. And your partner, well, they might be a stranger, or worse, a relative, because dynasties loved a good family reunion. They might be older or younger. They might not speak your language, though they certainly speak the language of duty, because tonight isn't about affection. It's about performance, about proving to God and your in-laws and half the nobility of Europe that you can do what's required of you, which is not as easy as it sounds when your hands are numb from the cold and your corset has been laced to within an inch of your breathing. There's a strange sort of loneliness in a room this large. The silence is thick, like someone forgot to remove the velvet from the air itself. Somewhere far off, a tapestry rustles, maybe a mouse, maybe the wind, maybe someone who should not be listening. But they always are. You shift on the mattress. It groans like an old man being asked to dance. You try not to laugh. Laughter would be undignified. And here, even awkwardness is political. The palace doesn't care if you're nervous, or tired, or hopelessly out of your depth. It just wants an heir. preferably a male one, and soon, and maybe two just in case the first one dies of a hunting accident or mysterious court poison. Oh, and ideally you fall in love. Not because it matters, but because the public likes a love story. It sells better at the market. It goes well with commemorative coins. So here you are, in the world's most uncomfortable bed, wrapped in obligations, lace, and a draft that seems to be personal. You have never felt less like a person and more like a diplomatic document. And somewhere, probably in the next room, a scribe is already writing down that the marriage was consummated. Even if you're still lying there staring at the ceiling, wondering when someone is going to knock and ask how it went. That's the thing about royal palaces. The doors are never really closed, the curtains never fully drawn, and the bed is never just a bed. It's a witness, a stage, a symbol, and tonight it remembers everything. The next morning, or what passes for morning, in a place where sunlight doesn't dare stream in without permission, someone will check the sheets. You don't get a say in that. At some point, maybe just after you've finally fallen asleep, tangled in your own hair and royal expectations, a maid will come in very quietly, very professionally, and gather up the linens like she's collecting evidence from a crime scene. Because that's what this is in a way. Evidence. Proof that duty was fulfilled, that your kingdom can exhale. And if she doesn't find what she's looking for, well, that's someone else's problem now. Or possibly yours forever. Because in royal palaces, sex wasn't a private act. It was an event, a moment. A publicly witnessed checkbox on the roadmap of dynastic survival. You didn't consummate a marriage because you felt like it. You did it because the court was watching, and the ambassador from Spain already sent a letter home, saying he thought you two looked distant at dinner. Now the timeline must be corrected, preferably by noise. That's right. They listened. Valets outside the chamber door, ladies pacing in the next room. Some courts even stationed notaries nearby. Yes, notaries who documented the sounds heard through the door as if orgasm could be notarized. In early modern France and parts of Spain, there was a ritual the bride would be escorted to the bed by older noblewomen. The groom would follow, flanked by male relatives. They didn't stay for the act, usually, but they did wait outside, pressing their ears to wood and pretending not to. Everyone hoped to hear something. Movement, giggles, a soft thud, a polite moan. If the room was too quiet, that was a problem. In Scotland, during the bedding ceremony, nobles would sometimes bang on the walls in encouragement, like the world's most misguided wedding band. And in a few very special, very cursed moments of history, witnesses were actually present in the room. Sitting discreetly in the corner like moral chaperones or extremely uncomfortable furniture. There's one record, a debated one, but still chilling, of a royal uncle solemnly nodding from a chair while his nephew tried to consummate his marriage with a trembling 16-year-old bride. She was reportedly so frightened that she clutched the edge of the mattress with white knuckles and prayed out loud. Romantic, no? Historians still debate whether these intrusions were as common as the records suggest, or whether they were symbolic holdovers from a time when the church and the state didn't trust anyone to handle a bed properly. But even if they were rare, they were real. Real enough to leave echoes. Real enough that you can still imagine the silence outside the door. A silence so sharp it hurts your ears. And yet, for all this supervision, very few people actually knew what to do once the curtains closed. Sex education was not exactly a royal priority. If you were lucky, a confessor might mutter vague advice about loving gently. If you were unlucky, an aunt would press a dried flower into your hand and whisper something about bees. You were expected to know, to just figure it out. And if you didn't, you faked it. Or you waited until someone came to check the sheets, and then you nodded solemnly like the rest of them. Sheets, by the way, were often embroidered with the family crest. Because even in your most intimate moment, someone wanted a reminder that this wasn't really about you. It was about bloodlines, banners, borders. One odd tradition from parts of Germany involved bedding documents signed by witnesses confirming the couple had shared a bed. If one party refused to sign, the marriage could be annulled. But the definitions were vague. Did share mean lying next to touching, doing the full choreographed routine nobody really wanted to clarify? Because clarification would mean acknowledging what everyone was pretending not to watch. There's something deeply surreal about being expected to perform desire in front of an invisible audience. It turns the act into something else, part performance art, part legal contract, part myth-making. Your body is not yours. Your breath is monitored, and the person beside you might be as terrified as you are. And if you think it ends after the wedding night, think again. Years later, arguments over succession would circle back to this very night. Did they really consummate the marriage? Were there witnesses? Was there blood on the sheets? Were the sounds convincing? Sometimes nobles who weren't even in the room would be asked to testify. One French court case hinged on the testimony of a distant cousin who claimed to have heard the faint rhythms of fulfillment from a hallway. Can you imagine your future riding on how convincingly someone described your hypothetical sex noises in court? But then again, maybe you can't imagine, because you're still lying in that bed. The silk canopy is stifling, your skin is cold, your mind is racing, and someone is definitely awake on the other side of the door. They might be scribbling notes, they might be praying, they might be counting the minutes until they can rush back and tell the Queen Mother what they think they heard. And you're trying to find the line between performance and reality, between duty and desire, between two people who've never really met but are now the centerpiece of a public ritual dressed up as a private moment. The bed creaks again. Someone coughs in the hallway. And just like that, the play begins. There's a candle flickering on the bedside table, its flame guttering against the drafts that sneak through stone walls older than your country. It throws long shadows on the tapestry's mythological beasts with glassy eyes and mouths half open in silence. The air smells of lavender and wax, but beneath it there's something else. Sweat. Starch. Fear. You've made it past the bedding ceremony, past the eyes in the hallway. The sheets have been collected, folded, and stored in some bureaucrat's ledger like they were pages of scripture. Congratulations. Now you get to do it again. And again. And again. Because one night is never enough. This isn't about sex. This is about succession. A queen who doesn't conceive within a year begins to hear whispers behind her back. 2 years, the whispers become questions. 3. You're a national crisis. No pressure, though. Your body is a geopolitical tool, a fragile mechanism tasked with merging empires, quelling rebellions, and producing at least 2 sons, 1 heir and 1 spare, just in case of a sudden jousting mishap or mysterious coughing fit. But before any of that, let's talk preparation. You might imagine a luxurious bath, a bed strewn with rose petals, a soft breeze through the curtains. That's cute. Now erase it. What you get is dusting powder, possibly rice flour, to tone down the sweat and oil from 3 layers of undergarments. You might be lucky enough to have your wig curled with iron tongs if it doesn't smell like scorched hair. It's not done right. Hygiene is interpretive. In some centuries, water was considered dangerous. Too much bathing, they said, opened the pores to demons and disease. So you masked odor with perfumes, sachets of herbs, or simply hoped your spouse had a poor sense of smell. Historical fact: Louis XIV of France had such an aversion to bathing that he reportedly took only 3 full baths in his life. His mistresses were expected to mask the resulting aroma with even heavier scents. Imagine trying to feel desire through layers of rosewater musk and very sweaty velvet. Meanwhile, you're expected to approach sex like a sacred duty. and sometimes it literally was. In Catholic courts, newlyweds might be instructed by their confessors to pray before the act. Not in the poetic sense, actual kneeling, actual scripture, actual divine pleading. Please, Lord, make this count. Not exactly foreplay. If you're wondering what this does to a person's relationship to their own body, well, historians still debate whether royal couples were more emotionally detached because of these rituals, or whether they developed their own ways of connecting despite them. In some places, though, the rituals leaned into sensuality. The Ottoman harems, for example, were full of ceremony, but of the deliberately seductive kind. Women were bathed in rosewater, massaged with perfumed oils, dressed in embroidered silks, and trained in the art of lingering glances. But even there, duty loomed large. A concubine's status could rise or fall overnight based on fertility. A pregnancy meant room's jewels' influence. A barren womb meant quiet removal from the rotation. No second chances. No do-overs. And then there's astrology. Yes, astrology. Court astrologers were often tasked with determining the most auspicious nights for conception. If Mars was in retrograde or the moon wasn't in the right house, better reschedule. A French nobleman once refused to sleep with his wife for an entire month because his astrologer told him Mercury was being dramatic. Did it work? Not for the marriage, but the stars stayed safe. And here's where things start to feel less like romance and more like data entry. Royal sex was logged, not metaphorically, actually logged. In court records, private journals, and sometimes by clergy. In England, during the Tudor era, nobles could be summoned to sign declarations that a marriage had been fulfilled, even if they weren't there to witness it. And if you think that's awkward, imagine having your fertility investigated by a group of men who haven't seen their own wives in weeks, because it happened. Midwives were called in, not just to assist with childbirth, but to examine whether sex had taken place at all. They were trained to recognize the signs, the symptoms, the stretch of the skin. If you were a bride and still hadn't conceived after a few weeks, they'd be back with more questions and very few gloves. And let's talk about proof. Blood on the sheets was the gold standard. Problem is, that assumes the woman was a virgin and the man was effective. Both highly unreliable assumptions. If there was no blood, it was the woman's fault. If there was too much, she was accused of being diseased. There was no right answer, just the right kind of evidence. Odd fact. In some royal households, fertility relics were placed under the couple's bed. These included bones of saints' letters written by apostles, or in one Spanish queen's case, a severed finger. She kept it under her pillow. For luck. Whatever gets the job done right. And through all of this, no one asked how you felt. No one cared if you wanted to, or if your partner did. The act was required, measured, sometimes, unfortunately, witnessed, and the result would ripple through history. So here you are again, wrapped in velvet, dusted in musk, knees bent in prayer maybe. The door is closed but not locked. The sheets are fresh. Someone will check them tomorrow. And tonight you don't get to be a person. You get to be a possibility, a maybe, an heir in waiting. It's one thing to be told your wedding night is public business. It's another thing entirely to be undressed. Like it's opening night at the theater. Because in royal palaces, getting ready for bed wasn't a private act. It was an event, a ceremony, a group activity with commentary. And it all starts with the layers. You might be wearing 5, 6, sometimes 7 layers of clothing. A corset so tight you can't cough without fainting. Petticoats wide enough to clear furniture as you walk. Stockings that have been rolled so precisely they look like sculpture. And jewelry, don't forget the jewelry, because it's important your future husband knows you come with both a dowry and 14 pounds of sapphire. And you're not taking any of this off yourself. Of course not. That's what attendants are for. In France, for instance, there was the femme de chambre, a woman whose sole job was to manage your body, to tie the ribbons, to remove the powder from your face without disturbing your hairstyle, to slide the garters from your thighs without wrinkling the lace, and to do it all while pretending she wasn't thinking about what was going to happen next. In some courts, the undressing was a ritual performed in front of other noblewomen who were there to observe. Not in the voyeuristic sense, more in the inspection sense. Think of it as a wellness check, with commentary. She's got good hips, one might whisper. Pity about the mole, another might say. It's lucky her skin is pale, it means she hasn't seen much sun. That's good for fertility. You smile. You say thank you. You try not to throw up. The final layer, of course, is the shift, a thin, white linen garment that covers everything and reveals just enough. You wear it like a veil, like a second skin, and when the last ribbon is untied, and your hair has been unbraided and brushed a ritual number of times, someone gives you a gentle nudge toward the door. Or the bed. Meanwhile, in the other room, your husband is undergoing the exact same humiliation, but with fewer flowers and more awkward silences. Gentlemen of the chamber remove his boots like they're disarming a weapon. His cravat is untied with solemn reverence. His nightshirt is presented like it's the Holy Grail. Someone hands him a goblet of wine and quietly asks if he's ready. What they mean is, will this be a scandal or a story? Because stories spread. One French queen's undressing was so detailed that it was later written down in a courtier's diary. He described the way her stockings rolled down her calves, how her hair shimmered in the candlelight, and how she whispered something to her maid that he never quite caught. He wasn't even in the room. He just knew someone who was, and this was normal. One historical oddity. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, newlyweds were sometimes given bed clocks, ornate timepieces to be placed near the mattress, supposedly to track how long the couple spent together. Whether they were meant to encourage endurance or punctuality remains unclear. But the sound of ticking is probably not the aphrodisiac you want echoing in the room. Let's talk about how long this undressing takes. By the time both of you are finally in your respective nightclothes, linen, long-sleeved, high-collared, and extremely unhelpful, an hour may have passed. The candles are burning low. The fireplace is coughing its last warm breath. Your stomach is queasy from too much wine and not enough explanation. And then you meet, not as lovers, not even as spouses, but as two people who've been handled all night. Two people who've been powdered and perfumed and advised. You're not quite sure how to look at each other. Do you nod? Do you say good luck? Do you pretend the maid didn't just comment on your knees? The bed itself doesn't help. It's enormous. Carved from oak, painted with gold leaf, and about as inviting as a parade float. You don't get into this bed, you climb it. There's often a stool involved, or a footman. And once you're on it, you lie very still because every creak is a potential headline. Royal beds were designed for display, not comfort. The mattress might be stuffed with horsehair. The pillows might be embroidered but flat. The canopy, gorgeous. Heavy. Traps heat like a furnace in summer and in winter. Well, there's a reason you're both still wearing socks. Sometimes the curtains are drawn shut, sometimes not. Depending on the court, someone might even come in and draw them for you. Like you're stage actors about to deliver your final scene. It's hard to feel spontaneous when three people have helped you take off your shoes. And just when you think, finally, you're alone, there's a cough from behind the tapestry, or a polite shuffle near the door. A servant posted just outside, just in case. In the Tudor court, some bedchambers were designed with antechambers, small rooms attached to the sleeping quarters, where servants slept with one ear open. If you made a noise, they heard it. If you didn't, they still heard something. Which brings us to the choreography. Because yes, even this had rules. Certain positions were encouraged. Others were considered inappropriate, even sinful. In conservative courts, missionary was the default. Anything else was animalistic, improper, or simply too French. Even kissing was complicated. A peck on the cheek, acceptable. A passionate kiss in bed, scandalous. One historian wrote that excessive affection between royals was seen as vulgar. Love, after all, was for commoners. You don't moan, you don't laugh, you don't flinch. You behave. And if something goes wrong, if a garter snags or a pillow slips, or you accidentally elbow your spouse in the nose, you don't acknowledge it. Because in a palace, even nakedness isn't free. It's supervised, it's evaluated, it's political. And when the deed is finally done, or at least when everyone decides it probably happened, you lie back and stare at the ceiling. The tassels sway slightly in the breeze. A servant collects your clothes from the floor. Somewhere a scribe sharpens his quill, and you try to remember what part of this was supposed to be yours. The palace is quiet now, but not the kind of quiet that invites sleep. This is the hush that comes when everyone knows something happened, but no one knows what it means yet. And somewhere in the maze of velvet hallways and candlelit staircases, the queen is sitting up in bed, alone, wrapped in wool satin and a lifetime of decorum. Because while she has the crown, the titles, the ceremonial robe, with all the embroidery that itches in the wrong places, she does not have the king. He's down the hall maybe, or maybe not. Maybe he's in the room directly above her, where the floorboards creak in the exact pattern she's memorized. Or maybe he's in someone else's chamber altogether. Someone whose name is already whispered behind fans and carved into bathroom walls with diamond-tipped rings. The mistress. Let's talk about her. Being a royal mistress wasn't a shameful secret. It was a position. In Versailles, the maîtresse en titre had her own apartments, her own staff, her own carriage, and sometimes more influence over royal policy than the actual queen. She was the one who sipped wine with the king in the late hours, who made him laugh, smile, write terrible poetry. She had the softest sheets, the warmest fire, the most fragrant perfume. She didn't have to conceive heirs. She didn't have to attend morning mass in jewels that pinched. She didn't have to pretend not to cry. She just had to keep him entertained. And in many cases, she was rewarded handsomely for it. Jewelry, estates, entire palaces if she played her cards right. Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's most famous mistress, was more than a lover. She was his advisor, his confidant, his interior decorator. Even after their physical relationship ended, she remained by his side. She even helped pick his next lovers. The queen, meanwhile, hosted luncheons, because that was her job, to endure, to remain dignified, to smile politely while rumors bloomed like mold on the walls, to raise the king's children, both legitimate and otherwise, without once letting the curve of her mouth betray her thoughts. Historical fact: Queen Maria Leschinska of France, married to Louis XIV, was so thoroughly sidelined by Madame de Pompadour that she was given her own wing of the palace to retire to quietly. No one expected her to be present, just presentable, and she wasn't alone. In England, Queen Caroline of Ansbach was married to George II, who maintained a long relationship with his mistress, Henrietta Howard. Court gossip adored Henrietta's grace and wit, often in front of Caroline. Caroline, ever the professional, once quipped, "I don't mind him having a mistress. I just wish she were prettier." We love a sarcastic queen. But make no mistake, queens didn't always lose. Some learned to wield their own kind of power. Not in the king's bed, but through diplomacy, patronage, and the soft tyranny of influence. Others turned a blind eye and built quiet alliances. And a rare few learned how to play the game themselves. Catherine the Great of Russia didn't wait for approval. She selected her lovers, personally maintained control of her image, and dismissed them with pensions and polite goodbyes when she was finished. Power, you see, wears many faces. Still, for most queens, the difference between her and the other woman wasn't just emotional, it was architectural. The mistress's room might be directly above the king's, with a staircase connecting the two. She could come and go as she pleased, her footsteps muffled by carpet but echoed in rumor. The queen's quarters were ceremonial, beautiful, and usually very far away, and that distance mattered, because it wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. She was the emblem of tradition, the guardian of bloodlines, the living embodiment of alliance. The mistress was the exception, the risk, the delight. The queen couldn't say no. The mistress could, and in that there was power. Historians still debate whether royal mistresses were liberated figures, women who controlled their own narrative, or merely ornamental, elevated only as long as their beauty and novelty endured. But queens endured regardless, even when they were hosting dinners for the women sleeping with their husbands. Even when their pregnancies were met with quiet shrugs because the king was seen laughing too loudly with someone else. Even when they sat alone at breakfast, while the other woman passed notes through servants, and still they smiled. One of the most surreal examples of this dynamic played out at Versailles, where mistresses were given official recognition. Madame du Barry, for instance, had portraits painted, poetry written, and entire galleries whispered about her presence. She didn't just enter the palace, she redecorated it. The queen, she was expected to stay on script. No jealousy, no outbursts, no refusal. Because queens weren't wives in the modern sense. They were contracts, signed, sealed, and very publicly delivered. And yet sometimes there were moments, quiet ones, where the queen and the mistress met eyes across a room, where a glance lingered just long enough to say, "I see you." Because in this glittering, suffocating world of brocade and candlelight, where everything was about appearances and protocol and producing sons, it was the women who knew the truth, who carried the emotional debris, who raised the children, wrote the letters, dried the tears that no one acknowledged. Sometimes they hated each other, sometimes they needed each other, and sometimes, just sometimes, they respected each other, but they never really got to choose. Not the queen, not the mistress, not even the king half the time. They were all participants in a game with no clear winner, just rooms, rules, and reputations so fragile they could shatter with a single misplaced sigh. So tonight, in this too-large bed beneath a canopy heavy with silence, the queen lies on one side, and just beyond the wall, laughter, perfume, a creak of footsteps not meant for her. The palace by now is deep into night. The laughter has faded to whispers. The wine has gone flat. The candles flicker like they too are gossiping behind your back. But there's something else in the air now. Not duty, not scandal. Something quieter, riskier. Something that can't be written down in court records or embroidered into a family crest. Desire. Not the kind assigned to you through treaties and tapestries, but the kind you're not supposed to have. The kind that lingers in the soft brush of a hand during a dance. In the way someone says your name just a little slower than they should. In royal palaces, forbidden love didn't knock loudly. It moved like mist. Through secret hallways, closed doors, and glances that lasted just one heartbeat too long. Let's start with the ones no one was supposed to talk about. Same-sex relationships were not just taboo, they were dangerous. In some courts, even a rumor of such affection could lead to exile, imprisonment, or worse. But people still found ways. King James I of England wrote letters to George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, that read like love songs wrapped in velvet. My sweet child and wife, he called him. My only joy. He was married. He had children. But the letters say what the history books try not to. And Queen Christina of Sweden, she refused to marry, wore men's clothes, surrounded herself with fiercely loyal women. Her letters to one companion are soaked in longing. She signed them with love. She meant it. Historians still debate how many of these relationships were romantic, sexual, or just deeply emotional. But the language is there. The ache is there. And when it comes to desire in a palace, sometimes ache is all that survives. Among ladies-in-waiting, affection was often hidden in plain sight. They lived in close quarters, shared beds, brushed each other's hair, exchanged perfume. Letters between some of these women read like modern love notes. "When I am not near you," one duchess wrote, "I sleep with your ribbon tied around my wrist. It is the only way I rest." No one questioned a ribbon, but everyone knew. There were tokens too. Lockets worn beneath the dress. Flowers with secret meanings, violets for devotion, hyacinths for longing, bluebells for secrets shared. These small symbols became entire languages for people who weren't allowed to speak their truth aloud. One fringe fact. In 18th century Prussia, Frederick the Great had a marble statue of Antoninus Emperor Hadrian's famously beloved companion placed in his private garden. Not in a public courtyard, not as political propaganda, in his private sanctuary. A quiet monument to something the rest of the court tried not to name. But let's not pretend same-sex desire was the only kind of forbidden love happening after dark. Sometimes it was the wrong rank. A nobleman and a chambermaid, a princess and a fencing instructor, a queen and her footman. Not impossible, just unwise. There are stories too many to count of glances exchanged during morning dressings or secret meetings arranged under the pretense of delivering a letter. Servants were both witnesses and participants sworn to silence, but not immune to feeling. And there were the letters. Always the letters. Folded carefully, written in code, delivered by trusted hands or slipped under doors with trembling fingers. A simple phrase, "The room was too warm tonight," could mean, "I miss you." "The garden is full of jasmine" might mean, "Meet me at midnight." The scent of someone else's perfume on a glove could ignite a week of whispered poetry and panic. But every touch carried a cost. Affairs between the wrong people weren't just scandalous, they were politically dangerous. If a queen became pregnant and the baby didn't look quite right, questions could unravel dynasties. If a favored courtier was discovered in the wrong bed, their career could end before breakfast. That's why so many of these stories end with a sigh, a scribbled note, or silence. Even the architecture was designed to keep secrets. Versailles had entire networks of secret doors and hidden staircases, allowing lovers to slip in and out without being seen. Or so they hoped. And even when they weren't caught, they were felt. A servant lingering too long at the threshold. A courtier refusing to make eye contact during dinner. A queen brushing a lock of hair behind her ear more nervously than usual. Desire leaves traces. One historian noted that during a particularly heated love affair in an Italian court, the amount of stolen glances and adjusted seating arrangements in public banquets could be tracked like moves on a chessboard. Even music wasn't safe. Some noblemen commissioned custom music boxes for their lovers' tunes that played a shared melody, maybe a hymn they once sang side by side in church, now repurposed for something more private. Because when you can't say "I love you," you leave it in a melody, a perfume, a pressed flower between pages of a prayer book. Sometimes it worked. There are letters, real ones, preserved in archives and museums that thrum with passion, resilience, and longing. Royal lovers who somehow, through luck or stealth, kept their connection alive through wars, politics, and the cold stone walls of the palace. But more often, these stories end in separation, in exile, in arranged marriages meant to silence a scandal, in names erased from court documents, in locks of hair buried beneath floorboards. And yet every time a new noble arrived at court, every time a glance lingered too long, the old game began again. Because no matter how many layers of lace and law you wrap around a person, desire still finds a way in. So tonight, you lie there, eyes wide open, the sheets still warm beside you, And in the dark, you wonder if someone else just down the hall is writing your name into a note they'll never send. Somewhere in the palace, a servant coughs into the quiet. A door creaks. A clock chimes. And a queen holds her breath. Because it's that time again, the time when everyone starts watching your stomach instead of your smile. Welcome to the never-ending saga of royal fertility. You've had sex, or something like it. Maybe more than once. Maybe with someone you tolerate. Maybe not with the person you're supposed to be with. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happens next, or doesn't. Because for queens, the real test wasn't consummation. It was conception. The palace begins to murmur if you haven't shown signs within a few months. The servants start exchanging glances when you skip the wine. If your face looks pale, expect a courier sent for a midwife. And if you sneeze, congratulations, you might be pregnant. Or not. And that, not, it's a problem. Historically, failure to conceive was rarely seen as a couple's problem. It was the woman's fault. Always. No matter how old the king was. No matter how many mistresses had also failed to produce an heir. No matter if the man's idea of foreplay was showing you a map of his kingdom. The womb, they said, had gone cold. Or turned away from duty. Or in one spectacularly imaginative diagnosis from a 16th century French court, it had climbed too high and needed to be coaxed back down with herbal fumes and optimistic music. True story. So the queen starts the rituals, the remedies, the regimen. There's wine mixed with powdered pearl, antler shavings dissolved in honey, amulets worn under the gown, letters from saints tucked into pillows, fingers crossed under the dining table. Some courts brought in astrologers. They'd calculate the most fertile nights by consulting moon phases and bloodlines. One king famously refused to touch his wife for 6 weeks because Mars was in a snit. Another insisted the bed be realigned to face Jerusalem. In Spain, one queen was advised to drink only warm goat's milk sleep on the left side of the bed and refrain from laughter, because apparently joy could scare the baby away. Odd fact. In Tudor England, it was believed that having too much sex after a pregnancy could weaken the queen's ability to carry future children. So after delivering an heir, many royal wives were encouraged, required, to abstain from intimacy. Their husbands, of course, were not similarly limited, and so began the endless cycle of expectations. You bloat pregnancy, you bleed failure. You blink too fast in church, someone writes a letter to the ambassador. If you're actually pregnant, things get worse. Pregnancies weren't private. They were performances. The moment your belly began to show your body became a bulletin board for international diplomacy. In France, queens were expected to give birth in public, or at least in a room filled with nobles, officials, and physicians. Why? To prevent baby swapping, they said. But also spectacle. In 1688, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth with over 50 people in the room. Because it wasn't enough to have a baby, you had to have a witnessed baby. Now imagine giving birth while a bishop takes notes. Even before labor midwives would inspect you weekly, feeling your pulse, sniffing your breath, sometimes even measuring your urine by color and scent. There were charts, reports, discussions held over breakfast that included the phrase tone of the womb. Miscarriages weren't treated with sympathy. They were state failures. Queen Anne of England had 17 pregnancies. None of her children lived past infancy. And yet she was expected to rule, to smile, to carry on hosting garden parties as if her body wasn't betraying her in front of the whole empire. And when a queen couldn't conceive at all, she became a liability. Her marriage might be annulled. A mistress might rise in her place. Or worse, she'd be exiled to a distant estate, politely forgotten her name, reduced to a footnote in a family tree. Historians still debate whether the pressure to produce heirs was political necessity or psychological cruelty dressed in lace. Likely both. But either way, it shaped every sigh, every silence, every stolen glance between spouses in the royal bed. There were, of course, attempts to assist. Physicians might prescribe sexual schedules, literal calendars hung in royal bedrooms marking the optimal nights to try. These often ignored any hint of passion or exhaustion. If your stars aligned on a Tuesday after a feast day, too bad. Duty calls. And when sex failed, the blame intensified. Some courts held formal inquiries into the fitness of royal couples. They brought in experts, clergy, confessors, sometimes even surgeons. In one Italian case, a prince was ordered to display his erection for 3 noble witnesses to prove he was capable of governance. And yes, they wrote a report. If the king couldn't perform, blame the queen for not inspiring him. If the queen didn't conceive, blame her blood. Her mind? Her posture? One poor queen was advised to sleep with her feet elevated and her thoughts cleared of melancholy. She lasted 3 years before being quietly replaced. And here's the final cruelty. Even when a queen succeeded, even when the child arrived whole and wailing her job wasn't done, because it had to be a boy, girls were polite disappointments. Sons were currency. A healthy male heir could secure treaties, fend off civil war, and keep the succession smooth. A daughter, well, she'd be married off eventually, hopefully not to a cousin, but probably to a cousin. So tonight you lie awake. Again. Your back aches, your temples throb, and somewhere down the hall, someone is already preparing the cradle, just in case. You feel nothing yet, but you whisper a prayer, not just for a child, but for a future in which your worth isn't measured by a missed period. There's something uncanny about a palace at midnight. The torches along the corridors have gone soft. The stone floors are too quiet, and the velvet bed curtains hold their breath like they're waiting for something to happen or unravel. Because in royal palaces, the bed is never just a bed. It's a throne in disguise, a war room, a courtroom, and sometimes a trap. Tonight it might be a stage, because what happens between those sheets can echo louder than a battle. And sometimes it only takes a whisper to collapse a crown. Let's start with scandal. The kind that drips like wax into every hallway, seeps into the servants' quarters, and dances in the mouths of bored courtiers. One of the most infamous royal scandals began not with an affair, but with a necklace. In 18th century France, a cunning conwoman tricked a cardinal into thinking Queen Marie Antoinette wanted him to purchase a wildly expensive diamond necklace on her behalf. The queen knew nothing. But when the scam was revealed, the public didn't care. The rumors of her decadence and her alleged lovers had already done their work. The damage irreversible. Royal sex scandals weren't just juicy. They were weapons, used by political enemies, whispered into the ears of foreign ambassadors, scribbled into pamphlets and passed around marketplaces like treasure. Sometimes they were even fabricated on purpose. A noblewoman rising too quickly at court, accuse her of sleeping with the king. A mistress getting too bold, leak a forged letter. Claim she poisoned the queen's perfume. Watch her burn. Historians still debate whether some of the biggest dynastic scandals were rooted in truth or cunning fiction. But the result was always the same: reputations crumbled faster than the palace bread. Odd fact. In early 18th century Russia, nobles kept scandal diaries, private little ledgers where they jotted down every rumor affair and suspicious tryst. Not for gossip's sake, for leverage. These weren't diaries. They were blackmail portfolios. But the most dangerous scandals weren't always based on sex. Sometimes they were about magic. Yes, magic. Because when reason failed, royals reached for candles and charms. When heirs didn't appear, they blamed curses. And when desire faded, they turned to potions made from rosemary toadbone and, unfortunately, human bodily fluids. One woman in France reportedly fed her lover a fig soaked in her own breast milk to bind him to her. When it didn't work, and she was caught, she was tried for sorcery. Then there's the infamous affair of the poisons. Also in France, where noblewomen, priests, and fortune-tellers were implicated in a vast network of black masses. Poisons and love spells meant to manipulate the royal court. Some were executed, some were quietly imprisoned. All were whispered about for centuries. Even palaces themselves weren't immune to enchantment. Secret passageways were built not just for convenience, but to enable or prevent secret liaisons. One Spanish queen allegedly had her bed exorcised after developing a mysterious rash on her inner thighs. The official report claimed it was caused by unholy energy. The servants just blamed the upholstery. There were talismans tied to bedposts, Saint bones under pillows, letters blessed by bishops. In England, one queen reportedly refused to allow her sheets to be changed without a priest's blessing, just in case her rivals had hidden a hex between the layers. But magic wasn't the only hidden threat in royal bedrooms. There were spies. Servants doubled as informants. Pages traded secrets for coin. Even ladies-in-waiting were sometimes bribed to report whether the queen seemed too cheerful after dinner or too pale during morning prayers. A misplaced glove, a quiet sigh, a bruise on the wrong collarbone. All of it could be recorded, sold, and weaponized, because in these palaces, perception ruled, not truth. And nowhere was perception more distorted than in the realm of impotence. Royal virility wasn't just personal, it was policy. A king who couldn't perform in bed was seen as weak, cursed, or both. If a queen failed to conceive, theologians might be summoned to debate the angle of her hips. And if neither party admitted fault, doctors would be invited to inspect them. Separately, in detail. Sometimes kings were required to prove they could function. In court, with witnesses. In Renaissance Italy, this actually happened. Men were made to demonstrate arousal or simulate intercourse in front of panels of noble experts. Not for pleasure, for paperwork. And if a queen tried to challenge the king's impotence, she risked everything. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry V, refused to say their marriage had never been consummated because she knew that admission would cost her the crown. Her refusal led to England splitting from the Catholic Church. So yes, bedroom politics could quite literally cause a reformation. Now imagine trying to fall asleep in a room where every sheet has been inspected, where every moan is interpreted as alliance or betrayal, where even silence might be considered incriminating. It's exhausting. So some people stopped waiting. Some queens, duchesses, and noblewomen began to take the lead. They selected lovers. They hosted private salons with music and wine. They initiated conversations meant to charm, seduce, or intimidate. They created spaces where they could, if only for a moment, choose. Catherine the Great of Russia had her lovers vetted, gifted, and gracefully dismissed when their time had passed. Margaret of Valois. Queen Margot used her affairs to survive civil war and collect intelligence. Even Anne of Austria, thought to be pious and passive, wielded emotional alliances like a dagger tucked in silk. Historians debate whether these women were truly free or just playing the same rigged game in prettier gowns. But one thing is clear. They understood the stakes. They knew that in the palace, sex wasn't private. It was theater. It was legislation. It was destiny in a brocade nightshirt. So tonight, as the last candle burns down, and the scent of someone else's perfume lingers too long in the room, you lie in your bed and realize you are not alone. The bed remembers, the walls remember, and someone somewhere is already writing down what they think happened tonight. And now, as the firelight fades and the echoes settle into silence, we come to the end of our long, whispered journey. You've wandered through brocade chambers and creaking beds, past jealous queens and calculating mistresses, through corridors that held secrets and rituals that held centuries of fear, hope, and human longing. In royal palaces, sex was never just about love, or desire, or even reproduction. It was a tool, a test, a stage where bodies were watched, judged, and rarely understood. But under all the lace and law, the crowns and canopies, there were people. Flawed, afraid, reaching for something warmer than duty. You don't need a title to understand them. You felt that pressure too. That ache to be seen, not measured. To be wanted, not managed. And now, as you rest your head and let your breathing slow, know this. The palace has quieted. But the stories remain, folded into sheets, tucked behind locked doors, whispered into candle smoke. And one day someone will remember yours too.